Okay, I think we are up and running, hopefully. Hello, everybody. I am Tilly. I run the social media for RBLI, and I am joined by the wonderful Neil Storey, who has been absolutely amazing helping us out with our VJ Day campaign, feeding into our booklet. I think you wrote pretty much all the booklet, didn't you, with us? Which you can see on our website, which is rbli.co.uk/VJ Day. But tonight is about learning about the campaign and what happened long after VE Day had finished. So Neil, please introduce yourself and take it away.
Hello, I'm Neil Storey. I'm a historian. People say, how do you become a historian? Well, I became a historian because of the people who were around me. I grew up mostly with my grandparents, and my grandfather served in the 14th Army out in Burma, 1942 to 45. In fact, he didn't get home until 1946. And my granny's brother, Oswald James Griffin, was a sergeant in the 5th Battalion, the Royal Norfolk Regiment. He was a territorial soldier. And I grew up with people that knew. Granddad knew so many people that knew Aussie. They were just nice old boys. And as a young man getting interested in history, I just wanted to know, why won't they talk about certain things? And some of the stories were left kind of hanging, and I wanted to know more. But I learned quite quickly, you can't press for some of those stories. It was like a mystery world to me as a kid. So from quite an early age, I started reading books. And once you read books and you mentioned a few things and you asked a few questions, the old boys would help you. And that it was the Far Eastern Prisoners of War group that were the first group to take me as a young historian to their hearts, really. They were nice old boys that held Aussie in a very, very high regard. And so it really kept my interest going. They gave me badges and medals and photos and memorabilia. And I felt that these were very precious. They wanted to find somebody, maybe their family wasn't interesting, or their family said, no, the boy does seem interested. And anyway, I remember some old boys that I knew were not very well. They had suffered life-changing injuries and suffered with disabilities that had been left as a legacy of their time in the Far East. In Norfolk, the Royal Norfolk Regiment had the 4th, 5th and 6th battalions. So that's getting on for 3,000 men, nigh on, that were all out at Singapore. Similar for the Suffolk Regiment, Cambridgeshire Regiment, 1 battalion. You had the Beds and Hearts. The 18th Division also had lads from Northumberland. They had a Blackpool Gunner Regiment. They had, that was the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, by the way. They had a battalion of those guys. They had Sherwood Foresters. So it was, although it was known as an East Anglian regiment, there were guys from away as well. But because they were very East Anglian, there were a lot of those boys around me. And I'll just clear up that the term Norfolk, in Norfolk, boy is short for neighbour, and I am a Norfolk man. And as Nelson said, I glory in being so. So if the boy is not condescending, that's my colloquial tongue. And there's no way anyone is going to shake that. And some of the stories that were told to me, that was told in the old boys. So if I lapse into the vernacular, then that's me. That's my ethnic identity. Anyhow, these lovely boys, and they were family men. They weren't professional soldiers. They're not all angels, don't get me wrong, but they were what they used to nickname the Saturday night soldiers. And the soldiers always thought that was quite funny, because when that came to needing them, they were there. And when war broke out, the part-time soldiers of the TA, they were mobilised full-time. And our lads of the 18th Eastern Division, a lot of them had been on coastal defence duty around Great Yarmouth and Galston, along the coast to Sheringham and Cromer and around that way, along that big bump of Norfolk in East Anglia. It'd been bitterly cold. and the sea froze. It was that cold. The lads that were at Weybourne Camp, the old boys used to call it Webben Camp in the vernacular. It was so cold that most of the toilets froze. There was only one,
pleasant.
and that was a very popular barrack hut. So it's somewhat ironic that these guys, having weathered that bitterly cold winter, they were expecting to go to France when war broke out. They thought, but no, not France. France had fallen. So a new war is opening up in the Western Desert, in the Middle East. And they thought, right, we're off there. And they end up going out South Africa. But when they pull out from the harbour, they didn't go the direction they expected. They went the other way. They'd been diverted. There's a thought that they really were intended for the desert, but they were diverted, and they went to Singapore. Now, there were already garrison troops there. Guys like from the Manchester Regiment had a big presence in the garrison at Singapore. When the 18th Division went in there as reinforcement, along with Indian Army troops and Australian troops, it was a big reinforcement for the island of Singapore. And what's really important is that they didn't march off the gangplanks into captivity. It's a myth. For the majority of those, for the 18th Division, they go off the gangplanks and they're very rapidly up across the causeway, what they call the causeway, from Singapore Island into the mainland, along the Straits of Johor. And the old boys, when I used to talk to them, they used to say, we fought like Bengal tigers, boy. And that was tough fighting. But the Japanese troops, they were mobile. And believe it or not, they were mobile because they were riding bicycles. They're very good jungle troops. And bicycles can go through narrow roadways and all sorts of terrain quickly, quietly, so you don't see the dust coming off the vehicles. What we didn't know is that the Japanese troops had pushed. They were really at a stretch anyway. But when we retreated to Singapore Island and they blew the causeway up, they still had to build defenses because the guns of Singapore were pointing out to sea, because they thought it would be a seaborne attack. They never thought it's going to come from the mainland. So the defenses are facing the wrong way. And so when the Japanese forces did come across in their boats, Surimbun Beach, it was held by Australian troops, the fighting rapidly, it's hand to hand, it's intense, and you're dealing with an awful lot. We're vastly outnumbered. Big numbers of Japanese coming at you. And it's a fighting retreat, really, and the Japanese are using boats to get inland. So it's a fight for Singapore. We mustn't make any mistake about it. Our boys and our allies, on the 15th of February, when Singapore fell, and the news reached the battle lines, and they've been fighting so hard, they knew it was tough. But I've known men, they said, we're the fort on, boy, we're the fort on. But there was nothing that could be done. It seemed certainly that the vastly superior numbers of the Japanese, it's where that sort of myth of the invincible Japanese enemy began. And we ended up, the agreement was the senior officers got together, Japanese and British, and the senior Japanese officer was absolutely dogged. He browbeat General Percival. He was quite an inexperienced general, really. He browbeat him. He's under enormous pressure. And they said, right, we're going to surrender by 8:30 tonight. And when that news went to the battle lines, there were men with their heads in their hands, crying, because they would have fought on. But there was nothing that could be done. And they end up being put into Japanese captivity. And that's just from really the core of British troops, it's around about 60,000. On top of that, you've got extra Allied troops, Indian Army, Australian Army, and then on top of that, Japanese captivity brought in civilians. We mustn't forget there's civilians that are put into detention camps. People might remember the TV series Tenko in Great Britain. So you've got civilians, including women, in detention camps. So it's a lot of people. And when the Japanese, they took the mainland, they took Malaya and pushed on into Burma, now Myanmar, they needed to have the supply lines. The British actually started the Burma-Siam Railway, but the Japanese took over the works, and they wanted to make that link. So that was in their mind, that they wanted to get the supplies, they wanted to hold the land, and they wanted us to work. They wanted the captured workforce to work, plus they were going to use people from occupied countries across the Far East that they'd occupied, from what is now Vietnam and across Malaya and into Singapore, a lot of Chinese labor. And they run into tens upon tens of thousands, far more than the British and Allied troops that were captured. So they didn't want the British to give them any trouble. So they put the majority of the British troops into a place called Selarang Square. Now you've got to remember, this is thousands of men into a small square. You think of a city square, something like that, right? It's got limited water supply, and they are given pieces of paper where they must swear upon their honor not to escape. You have to sign it. And the British held out, and it was getting pretty ropey there. And in the end, the officers said, well, sign it, lads, but it doesn't mean anything. Just sign it so we can get out. And then before you knew it, they got out of Selarang, and they were put, what a lot of the old boys called, they went up country. And when they went up country, they're working at various positions along the extant railway, and a lot of men forging forward, using substandard tools, not being allowed proper medical treatment. If you were ill, they'd still try and make you work. Men suffering from tropical illnesses, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, men with ulcers. You get a cut in the jungle.
Yeah,
you get infected. Oh. There were doctors having to perform surgery using razor blades. You know, it was, I mean, the ingenuity that they showed to survive was incredible, but men were not fed very well, just dirt. They used to call it dirty rice, not in the nice way you'll see it in restaurants now. Dirty rice, boiled in dirty water, horrible bits in it, minimal food for you to work. And if you didn't work, or if you were too ill to work, or you were too exhausted, and you would work from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, there would often be beatings administered. If you are caught anything untoward, some men, there were quite a number of artists, people like Ronald Searle and Leo Rawlins. They did drawings of the things that they saw and what they experienced and the illnesses of their comrades. They got caught with them, that could have meant death. There were some men that managed to secrete radios so they could try and work out what's going on. Get caught with that, death. If you are anything underwater, it could get you a beating. Now, what we must remember is that this is another generation. We must not breed hate. Hate is part of the reason why wars start. But if we don't learn from history, if we don't know about what has happened in the past, then we're doomed, we're damned to repeat it. And that's why we talk about it. It's why VJ is so important. And it's easy for people to just skate over the story of the prisoners of war. It's bad enough we have a forgotten army in Burma, and I'll be telling you more about them later. But these were the first lads. This is 1942, and they were there in captivity, building that railway until late 43, and in 44, when the railway is pretty much complete, those that were judged fit enough to go into further labour camps, some were retained to maintain the railway. They were sent to the Japanese mainland, and again they were labouring. And the joke was, some of the lads you see, they're from the Sherwood Foresters, from Northumberland. They'd been miners before the war, and they end up in forced labour down the mine. And that was not just coal mines, salt mines, hard labour on farms. So VJ meant a liberation for these men from not just captivity, but hard labour and degradation. And all the old boys that I knew always said that it was thanks to one of their comrades that they got through. And so the motto of the Far Eastern Prisoners of War Association was keep going the spirit that kept us going.
Oh, that's really lovely. And I think, it's still true today with the soldiers today, that is basically how they keep going. It is your comrades, it's your friends around you that spur you on and keep you going. So yeah, wow. Well, powerful stuff, Neil. We've had a few questions in. Mary says, how many British servicemen and women died as prisoners of war or as a result of fighting?
Well, if we're talking about the work on the railway and the Far Eastern prisoners of war after Singapore, it was, if you think about the core of British troops, it's roughly 60,000. Remember, there's a lot more from other countries as well. 60,000. About a third of those lads didn't come home. But in saying that, we must, that there were literally tens of thousands of labourers from the occupied countries, forced labour, that were the Far Eastern prisoners. I knew they said that the labourers from the occupied countries, they were in far worse camps than even they were in, and they were going through hell. And so their numbers run into the conservative estimate for the labour force that died building the Burma Railway is around about 60,000. But that's dead.
Yeah, there's still a lot that were injured and have lived with, yeah.
And it's in mind and body and soul. And I knew men that up until weeks, months before they died, 70 years later, were still having nightmares. Or illnesses such as malaria, you can take the tablets and then it will go into a stasis, and then it will recur years later. And I remember seeing old boys, my granddad, bless him, had malaria. It came back when I was a kid. I wondered what on earth was wrong with him.
You've not been on holiday?
Well, that was a holiday he had in Burma, but maybe a holiday on.
Crikey. So how many years after he got back did that happen?
It had been in the late 70s.
Wow. So that really is a long time for it to...
But he wasn't unique.
No, yeah.
And we mustn't forget as well that we've got those that were captured and people incarcerated at the fall of Singapore. Add into that, if you are fighting the war out in Burma, and the casualty rates were horrific out there, those that were taken prisoner, some of them also got sent out to labour as well. Some of them also got sent, they were detained. There was a big detention area in Burma, in Rangoon jail. And again, the men, they get reduced to living skeletons. They're just not fed. They're not allowed. They're given minimal food. The Red Cross parcels that are sent out to them, they don't receive them.
Right. Yeah, Billy watched he's 6 years old and he watched your video on food. And he says, what did prisoners of war eat? Did they eat the same rations?
Well, all the old boys that I knew loved kids, and they always made a fuss of me. And they used to give me a sweet, and I'd have 5p put in my hand. Sounds like 100 years ago, but it wasn't. That was in the 70s. They're nice old boys. So hello, Billy, and thank you for listening, and thank you to all the children that have been so kind and getting in contact and enjoying the project. The prisoners of war, if you, as an average, would have to live off a bowl of rice a day.
Wow. And with all that hard work as well.
Yeah. That absolute malnourished fellas. It was absolutely horrific. So you'd have to, if you could sneak a little bit of fruit when you're getting through the jungle, sometimes there might be some things will come to you a little bit through the parcels, but
not enough.
Not enough.
Mark says, why were the Japanese so cruel to prisoners of war?
The old.
I guess that's a difficult one to answer, really, isn't it?
They used to say we could have built, and I shan't use the language that they used, that bloomin' railway. We could have built that, and they just didn't need to treat you like it. There is a certain argument that the Japanese had their culture was very different, and it was this notion of bushido, which is where that if you and they supposedly served under the belief that if you are taken prisoner, then you're worthless. That's dishonorable. But the thing was, in 1945, did fall on their swords, but there was plenty handing their swords over as well and lived to tell the tale. So I'm not quite sure how avidly they pursued Bushido when it came down to them.
Yeah.
Don't deal in hate, ladies and gentlemen. It was
no
need to do it. And the lesson all of those veterans would want is just don't let it happen again. Don't let hate in your life. That's destructive.
Yeah. So when the prisoners of war camps closed, or when the news came out that Japan had surrendered, what happened to those prisoners of war? Did the guards still stay? There are stories that people didn't believe that the war was over. So was it still going on? How did that work?
What happened was the news got through to a number of the camps, and the men that had been so badly treated realized that the guards were suddenly becoming quite cringing and servile towards them, being extra nice. And some of the guards said, we know that you have a radio and you know that things have changed now. And they tried to treat them in a different way. And then one day, when VJ Day came for a lot of these camps, the guards had just disappeared when the men woke up in the morning. They'd just disappeared into the night. And for the camps that were being a bit sticky, deeper in the country, they actually they parachuted officers and men in with all the proper forms in multi-language that could be handed over and say, there we are, these men are now free.
Wow. So yeah, they must have had a sharp exit made by a few of them by the sounds of it.
After the war.
Yeah. Diane says, thank you for sharing this history with us.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you for taking that interest. I'm just one voice. And when I wrote my first book on the Far Eastern prisoners of war, it was just on the lads of the Norfolk Regiment in 1992. I had 22 veterans that had helped me with the book, including some of the last senior officers of the battalions. There were lovely people like Harry Shulman and Tommy Eaton, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Cubitt, actually signed his, the 3 senior officers put their names to the forward. And it turned out that Alan was dying. And so literally it was on his deathbed. But his second in command, dear old Monty Smythe, said he wanted to do it. He wanted to. And this was it. This is why, when I've met veterans over the years, their family said, my dad's never talked about that. And you're quite right. They just want to shut it away. But if they could just tell it well and tell it once and have it recorded or written down, that's kind of getting it out. And it's done then. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I hope. These were, when they got home, they just wanted to be at home. They wanted to be with their families, and they were lovely granddads. All the families that I knew, they were just lovely. But there's a funny little story about coming home. That these boys, when they got back, they didn't let them come straight back after release. For a lot of them, they were actually transported to Canada to be fattened up in such bad shape. They didn't want them coming back immediately. And the families hadn't heard from them. You've got to remember that the families were expecting them to go to North Africa. By the time Singapore had fallen, a lot of them still didn't know where their loved ones were. And it was only really when we start getting towards October, November, even December, people had confirmation that their relative was either a prisoner of war, dead, or worst of all, missing. And that's how it was. There was hope for those lads that were posted missing. There was hope that lingered on years after the war. And that's my great uncle Oswald. He was posted missing. That's all the family knew. It's one of the reasons why I got involved with history, because my granny got upset every single February. There would be something that would trigger the memory of the loss of her brother. There'd be tears. I can feel it now in my throat. And I wanted to at least try and find out. And as a naive youngster, I thought maybe he's in a little tribal camp somewhere in the back end of Malaya. But I found his comrades. They were great. They couldn't tell me exactly what had happened, but they got me in touch with Bob Hammond, who was his company commander, Major Bob Hammond, good author as well, a true gentleman and a very good good officer. And Bob Hammond wrote a long letter explaining that Uncle Oswald had been injured at Brattle Road. Brattle Road was a very dangerous area. If they're listening, there's family of old Frosty. Frosty was in the 5th Battalion, and he was a very brave soldier. The Japanese had rubbish grenades, and they were throwing grenades, and Frosty picked them up and threw them back. He got the military medal for that.
Wow.
Frost family. They had some guts, I'll tell you. Bob Hammond said that they'd been attacked, and Ozzy had been cut on the arm by a Japanese sword. And he had to order him to go to hospital, and the hospital was attacked. This was Alexandra Hospital. Men were bayoneted in the beds. It was just horrific. And so Ozzy was with another sergeant and said, look, lads, get out if you can, walking wounded. And he and another sergeant put the fists up, and that's the last time they saw him.
Wow, what an amazing story. And
he's just on a memorial wall. So I hope maybe one day, maybe there'll be some remains found. My DNA's on the family tree site. And I'd urge people, if you do have family that are missing out there somewhere, try and get your family tree on, get your DNA there. So if they do find them, maybe they can name them like they have done for First World War soldiers.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. They'll find them one day. No one can be.
Yeah. No.
But they were very, very brave soldiers.
Definitely. I will second that. And with that, I think we're running out of time. So thank you so much, Neil. Really appreciate everything. We've got more videos coming with Neil next week and the week after up to VJ Day. And we'll be back with another Facebook Live just before VJ Day 2. So if you'd like to find out a little bit more, you can go to our website, which is www.rbli.co.uk/VJ Day. There you can get your hands on a special edition VJ Day Tommy as well, which comes with a great booklet that Neil has had such a huge part in writing to really help tell the stories of these soldiers, and not just our soldiers, but the soldiers from all the nations that supported us in that campaign. So that's rbli.co.uk/VJ Day. Head on over, find out some more, and keep an eye on our Facebook for more from Neil.
Thank you very much. Good night,
everybody. Thank you so much, Neil. Bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.